There's always too much to fit into half an hour, so on this extended cut of Death of the Reader, you'll hear more on structures, more on theories, and more on why an 80-year-old man can't climb a 2-story building. All that and more this week on the Death of the Reader extended cut. Welcome to Death of the Reader, your murder mystery world tour on 2SER 107.3.
I'm Hertz, he's Flex, this is the hottest new show.
Or the corpsiest new show, seeing as they are murders.
That's awful.
Well, so is murder, and that's what we'll be exploring as we take you through some of the iconic works from the murder mystery genre from around the world.
Yeah, we're going to get you guys excited about detective fiction and teach you why it's an even better time waste than video games.
It's one of these things, people talk a lot about the replayability of media products when you get them, and, you know, all of these things like, oh, wow, you know, the Netflix special that you can go back and find all of the different endings or whatever. But, you know, detective fiction's been here for hundreds of years, and it's been doing all of these things.
Yeah, it's crazy. Murder mystery and detective fiction all built on this idea of this puzzle you have to solve, and no read is the same.
Yeah, so tell us a bit about the novel we're looking at today, Herds.
Sure, yeah, Flex. Today we're discussing chapters 1 to 7 of The Three Taps, and we'll be tackling in bits over the next 3 weeks. It was authored by Ronald A. Knox. He's an old bloke who helped shape the mystery genre.
Later on the show, we'll be taking a deeper dive into who Knox is and all the things he did to the genre, his superhero origin story. But right now we have a novel to unpack.
Have you perhaps heard of A Series of Unfortunate Events by Lemony Snicket? A tale marked by misery and yet rife with absurdist humor and bad English puns. The Three Taps is not so different. It begins laying out the mystery with a lengthy description of an insurance company.
The man who is insured with the indescribable walks the world in armor of proof. Those contrary accidents and mortifications which were a source of spiritual profit to the saint are a source of material advantage to him. They tell stories of a client who murmured, "Thank God!" as he fell down a lift shaft, and a shipwrecked passenger who manifested the liveliest annoyance at the promptness of his rescuers when he was being paid for floating in a lifebelt at the rate of £10 a minute. So thoroughly has the indescribable reversed our scale of values here below. The one thing I really love about the introduction and description of the indescribable is both the absurdist style of humor that we have going at it, but also how timeless it feels. The way that they're introduced feels like you could drop it in, you know, the late 90s and it wouldn't sound out of place. Aside from a few artifacts of older style language, there's nothing that really would be out of place in a modern novel.
One of the things that really stood out to me to Lemony Snicket's writing is how he breaks the fourth wall. He constantly is doing this. One of my favorite parts is in the Ersatz elevator when we're falling down the elevator. He's like, I couldn't describe to you how dark the elevator was except by this. And he flipped the page. It's just like black, just like the whole page for 6 pages is just black ink.
I'm so immersed. It's
great.
dark.
And yeah, The Three Taps is a similar moment where Knox, you know, he introduces Leyland and it's like, oh, Leyland, the policeman. He's like an important part of the story, probably.
Because Bredon and Leyland are good friends from a unit they used to be in the war. And he just says, I will not waste your time with their reminiscences, which is a very big fourth wall break. Can maybe shatter your immersion, but at the same time, I think it's a really good way to deliver that scene because it doesn't mean that we're wasting time with things outside the story.
Yeah, it's fun because Lemony Snicket's series obviously is written to sound like it's, you know, it's in the past. And in many points, it's kind of satirizing that old-timey, you know, writing. He's an English professor, I think, the actual author who wrote the novel. And so he makes all sorts of fun jokes about this is how he used to speak back in the olden days. But Knox has kind of done the opposite. And I think that the novel has actually aged very well, this story without a moral.
I think the other thing that's really fun about the introduction of the indescribable is the introduction of their euthanasia policy.
The euthanasia? What have they done to you?
Who knows?
Flex? What have the euthanasia done to you?
So
that's all I'm saying.
Basically, it's this policy that if you die before the age of 65, your family gets a huge payout from the indescribable. But if you survive past 65, you then get a very high-paying pension from this policy.
Yeah.
And our murder victim this time around dies just before his policy is about to tick over to the pension, which means that the 0 people that he has left on his will are going to get an enormous amount of money. And herein lies the crux of our murder.
Yeah, it really sets up this kind of fantastical murder of a man who knew he was going to die and nobody believed him, and this very strange setting that that Knox is trying to lay out for us with, what's his name? Mottram, I believe?
Jephthah Mottram.
That's him. Yeah, a very well-to-do sort, but who is in a panic because he knows when he's going to cark it.
One of the really interesting things about the way that Mottram's death is presented in this novel that I really love from the puzzle sense is the way that it sets up that, it's not who killed him, it's did anyone kill him at all?
Yeah, we're presented with a very kind of fun puzzle when we first reach the scene of the crime. There are the titular 3 taps, and they seem to have been turned off in a peculiar manner. That being that we can't determine if they've been turned off because there are no fingerprints. It's kind of a weird setup, and there's the indication that perhaps Mottram might have taken his own life. And that's why our hero, Miles Brendan... Brendan, I know what I said. Miles Brendan is sent in to investigate.
Now, these 3 gas taps, one of the fun things about the way that they're set up, as you say, is that they're set in a position where it doesn't really make sense that it would have been a murder, because we can see where it was turned on, but not that it was turned off. And there's also one master switch that controls 2 other switches. And I don't want to sit here and run you through all of the mathematical possibilities of how the gas taps could have been set.
Because we all know that's what people are here for a murder mystery.
Yes.
The maths. the maths of murder, you might say.
But basically, it makes it seem like it was probably an accident or suicide. But of course, if it's a suicide, then he wouldn't have received his payout. And if it was an accident, then, the police's criminal investigation doesn't have to carry on.
Yeah.
So there's this big contention between our 2 detective characters, Miles Brendan and Leyland, his former buddy from his old unit in the war.
Yeah. Yeah, we're presented with this very interesting kind of tension between the 2 of them, and it really drives their investigation going forward because, of course, Brendan's trying to prove that it was a suicide, and Leyland is trying to prove that it's a murder, and they kind of clash in a friendly way. And that's something that I find really cool about this novel. It's trying to set up this, this detective cop relationship with the malgré Louis, the detective, in spite of himself.
There's a big notoriety for a lot of old school detectives where the longer those detectives kind of stuck around in the series that the author wrote them, the more people and the author tend to tire of them because they basically just became so forthright and pretentious about how good they were at solving things that they were no longer likable. And I think that the way that Knox is engaging with the emotion of these 2 friends with differing opinions battling out over who's right kind of makes them a lot more personable than a lot of detectives otherwise would be.
Yeah, well, watching how the detectives have changed, Sherlock in particular was very much like that. And Brendan is the antithesis of that. But then in the Robert Downey Jr. Sherlock Holmes adaptation, we see this very Marguerite Louis detective, right? He doesn't get along with people. He only really takes the cases that he likes. It's kind of a lot more similar to what Knox is portraying here with Brendan than the actual Sherlock Holmes character.
I think that the fact that the BBC adaptation of Sherlock has done a similar thing where so much of the story is focused on him as a character and his struggles with drug addiction and all of these things. They're definitely things that were present in the original series, but modern understandings of storytelling have demonstrated that people respond better to that than just, oh, look at this Übermensch of reasoning. And I think one of the other things that's really interesting about the role of the detectives in these stories is that when it comes to, a game approach to murder mystery novels, Miles Brendan is your first-person perspective. He's the one whose camera you're looking out of in the TV show of this story. And the role of the detective is something that our author, Knox, was really big on in this certain piece of theory he wrote about.
Yeah. He wrote, he was a churchman back in the day, this old bloke. And so he took it upon himself to write up a series of rules to try to order fair play detective fiction, which is kind of the broader, part of the genre of murder mystery.
One of the things that I really love about the way Knox writes stories is he's a guy that is so clearly engaged with how people read stories. One thing you might have heard of, this little piece of media history called War of the Worlds by Orson Welles.
Never heard of it.
Only a defining piece of, radio media, was actually inspired significantly by an earlier similar stunt by Ronald Knox because he was also a radio broadcaster.
So we're basically sitting in his shoes right now.
I'd hope so. I hope we can, convince the entire city of London on a snowy morning that the end has come.
Well, we'd have to move to London first.
Well, the internet's powerful these days.
It's true. We could broadcast all the way to London. We could do that.
You'd come with us to London, right?
Yeah, let's go.
Now, the Decalogue that he wrote up, these rules for the murder mystery genre, kind of lay out, the fair play. If we're going back to the game analogy, this is the game engine that Knox works with. They're the constraints that you don't really escape from, and it's all about fair play so that you don't get to the novel like you got to the end of Ocean's 12 and discover that the entire movie was worthless because of this one montage that undoes everything else.
Yeah, I mean, it functions in a similar way to foreshadowing. If you got the Chekhov's gun in the bar at the start of the movie, it should be fired by the end. By the same token, you should do very simple things like foreshadowing the criminal, having them be present in the story, having them not be some, very obvious foreign villain out for their own gain. Those are the sorts of rules that he lays down.
So by chapter 7, where we're discussing up to today, that means we should already have all the pieces on the table.
We should have.
The very engaged reader should realistically already have a feasible, if not complete, solution.
They should certainly have the inkling of one, at the very least.
Coming up a bit later on the show, we'll be discussing our solutions, having a bit of a fight about who's right, who is the criminal, was there a criminal at all, but you'll have to stick around for that.
Don't worry, Flex, I'll go easy on you.
I don't believe you for a second.
Ha!
But speaking of rules, there's this little thing in, media studies called structuralism, Herds.
I've never heard of it.
Well, the good news is for you, Herds, I sat down with Andrew Pople from Final Draft to chat a bit about it so you can learn. Stick around for that. Hey, you're listening to Death of the Reader on 2SER 107.3. We're here with Andrew Pople from Final Draft. Andrew, how are you?
Hey, Felix, I'm good. How are you?
I'm going very well. So, we've been speaking on the show today a bit about structuralism, and that's kind of, the first time I'm seriously going to address that word.
Okay.
Are you familiar with structuralism?
When you're talking about structuralism, I think in my head I'm looking at it from a few different backgrounds as what I would know as narrative theory.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so particularly with structuralism, kind of the main pop culture-y one is the 12 steps of the hero's journey. Like that's the one that I think most people cover in high school. It's prevalent in Star Wars. It's in a bunch of other things, Lord of the Rings. It's kind of one of the defining narratology structuralist theories. And I wanted to sit down because we're talking about Ronald Knox, and he's sort of made this structuralist theory we're speaking about on the program today his Decalogue, which is his rules of fair play for murder mystery. Now, I wanted to talk with you about structuralism and see how you think structuralism can help or hinder some stories, because it's one of these things where, you get two stories and they have a very similar structure and people will say, well, that's just ripping this off. How do you think that having a set defined structure that's, I guess, tried and tested can help a story?
So structures do this really interesting thing in a story, and I think an important question to ask is whether the structure is imposed or whether it's observed. So for someone like Knox, who I'm not as familiar with, but part of his oeuvre, he was coming out from, some sort of for 20 years before he was even born. We had people like Wilkie Collins, and then we have the Conan Doyles of the world, and they did things with their fiction, their detective fiction, and then people observed, oh, well, here's what works, here's what didn't. I mean, the great thing about rules is they're, often defined in their breaking. So I think when I look at Knox's Decalogue, what he's trying to do is say, well, this is how the story is not only going to work, but it's going to be a good story. And fair play is a really interesting word there, because a lot of the things he does are there to make it fair, not just for his characters or other writers' characters, but for the reader. And one thing that really interests me is the idea that the reader kind of has to have a fair chance. There's a sense of manners, but there's also a sense that the reader can be a part of the story. The reader has the information to maybe solve the crime themselves, and that's definitely a good thing for an engaged reader.
Yeah, that's the one thing that I really like about the Knox Decalogue is it kind of defines murder mystery as the early interactive medium of its era. It's a game that you get to play against the author. It's not unheard of for an author to jump into a story in murder mystery and say like, hey, how are you going solving it? because that's kind of the approach that they take with these puzzles. So having this observed structure and seeing what puzzles have worked, how it's fair for the reader so you don't feel bamboozled when you come out the tail side, I think is really good in a murder mystery context.
We need it to be there. We need to feel like we've got a fair chance if we want to be engaged. I mean, I like reading stories like that. I hate getting to the end of something that is a mystery to be solved and looking back and thinking, I don't think I could have done that because, and this is one of the rules, it can't be too bizarre, far-fetched. I think I jotted them down in my own shorthand, but things like you can only have one secret room, and I wrote down you can have no wacky science, but I believe Ronald Knox also included things like unknown poisons, and he was really talking about technology. Of course, the rules have changed very much in the near 100 years, but I like the idea of there being a fair chance. Of course, we then get stuck in that area of, if we read enough of these, we could almost write it ourselves once we know who the characters are.
Yeah, there's this big trope in murder mystery called the closed room, which is basically that someone has died or a crime has happened in a room, but it couldn't have happened because the door was locked from the inside, which meant that is the criminal still in there? And the trick always ends up being that it's not actually a closed room. It's something that makes it seem like one. And that's kind of the risk that you say that these rules can bring us towards where, we know what's happening. Like, come on, give us something fresh.
Yeah, it's a game of Poe and monkeys, really. That then gets innovated on, and I think that's one of the things we can see now, that technologically we have the ability to make visual narratives, film, TV, where the closed room is happening in space. The closed room is happening in, well, I can't say I've actually seen this yet, but we're going to see it in sort of microscopic realms. I mean, I'm sure there's a great Ant-Man coming up where the closed room is actually in the quantum realm, but because we can muck around realistically with areas that were, I guess, wacky, were a bit too bizarre in Ronald Knox's era, we can innovate. I think it's the other areas that we need to be wary of. We need to be wary of, and this plays into the idea of the hero's journey. The hero's journey is linear, whereas Knox's Decalogue is instructive, but you don't have to follow a step by step. In the hero's journey, we can reasonably say, oh, well, I think I know what's going to happen next.
Yeah,
because the hero's journey has to happen in a certain way. If we know the rules too well, it can be hard for the writer to work within them. But I think also there's an element of tongue-in-cheek about Knox where, and I think other commentators where they say, well, also, we're going to break something.
Oh yeah, there's definitely a lot of moments, especially in the Three Taps, the novel we're covering this week, which is just openly absurdist about the way that the rules of the genre are applied. And I think that the self-awareness of things like that is particularly fantastic. A more modern example would be something like Altered Carbon, not strictly a murder mystery, but especially with its Netflix reboot. The one thing that's really fun about that as a murder mystery is the victim's alive because he's effectively been resurrected. And the way that you can still play and innovate off these rules is fantastic and broad and exciting.
And we're sort of getting into the realm of that hated word right now, which is postmodernism, where as soon as you've got rules, you can be self-referential. And I mean, I haven't actually watched Altered Carbon, but I mean, the resurrected character is just that became that hackneyed trope of the sort of the heroic comic sort of thing, and we just got sick of characters being resurrected. It's great that they've resurrected it, made it a part of the plot, and now suddenly we have to solve the murder that isn't a murder.
Exactly. Now, I think the other thing that always interests me, particularly with things like the steps of the hero's journey and narratology, is the idea of the repetitive things that, they seem derivative because they're drawing from the same source material. Like, for example, Mortal Engines, which again just had a film made of it, feels extremely derivative of things like Star Wars. How do you think that authors can approach using these structures while still innovating without having to break the rules?
I think on the one hand, to a certain extent, authors don't have to worry about that. I don't know where you live, Felix, but I know in my suburb there's at least a few places I can get pizza. And these places are not worried that they have to constantly innovate pizza. They do, and sometimes it's terrible. But, the basic structure doesn't change because they know that we'll always have an appetite for pizza. And I think for certain things, space operas being one of them, we will always have an appetite. And for people that want to eat pizza every day, you only have to change the space opera just a little bit and you'll get an audience. For people that want to do it well, I think we're now in that realm of how do we one, break the rules in a savvy way, and two, I think maybe coming back to that, looking at the idea of narrative theory, is it descriptive or is it prescriptive? Is it forming us or are we forming it? And looking at who is actually doing the formation. And you sort of, when you asked me to come on, we were going to get to a little bit to narratives that might be doing something different. And what strikes me with the hero's journey is very individualistic. It's also quite Western in a lot of the places that it was drawn from, and it can be dismissive of non-dominant cultures. So if we want to pick something like A Lord of the Rings, the non-human identifying type characters, whether they be dwarves or elves, are part of the journey, but they're not central to the journey. I think we can sort of see that often the hero is code for a white male, so or whiteness in general or maleness in general. And so some of the really interesting ways we can look at that if we want to explore literature is to look at how non-dominant culture starts to figure into those journeys or subvert them completely.
Yeah, I think that was one kind of interesting thing that The Lord of the Rings did in particular is, outside of the whole race story, it wasn't even necessarily our main character that follows the hero's journey. It's one of the companions that follows it. And the way that each of the companions in that story kind of does have their own arc and it follows them each individually. So we do get to explore those separate identities rather than just, the hero. Because we've done that, right?
So what I thought as just an example, and I didn't draw exclusively on detective fiction, although I did think a little bit about some mystery and detective fiction that I've been reading recently. One book that I wanted to bring to you was Terra Nullius.
Terra Nullius.
Yeah, so it's the author is Claire G. Coleman. Came out in 2017. And this book looks at a sort of a future history of Australia. And one of the things that we see in this story, there are broadly settlers and there are broadly natives, and they're called in this history of Australia. And what we see in a narrative told from a native's perspective, as they're figured by Claire G. Coleman, is that a traditional hero's narrative isn't going to work. The call can come. There can be stages where there is processes of learning. There can be mentors. But in a society that has been utterly changed, there is no going out and then coming back and winning per se. You have this ultimate dealing with a new reality. There is a fantastic twist in this. And it breaks a whole lot of rules of the Decalogue, but as it's not strictly a detective story, it doesn't matter. But what we see is that for a non-dominant culture like Indigenous Australians, there is no traditional ending for, say, a hero's journey. So we have this really interesting new sense of, well, where do we go after about step 6 or step 7 of the hero's journey? And we have to start to look at new ways of bringing a story to a close. And I imagine, because I'm a white Australian, so I am not part of that cultural tradition and that bloody history. So I don't know how that is being worked out. And I suspect that this is a narrative process that's working out. Compare that though to maybe a different area, zombie fiction.
Yeah.
And a great novel that's come out recently by an author named Alison Evans is Highway Bodies, which looks at groups of queer and gender fluid teens who kind of awake to the zombie apocalypse. Now, not only do they not fit the traditional hero's narrative, the zombie apocalypse, again, presents that situation of there is no end.
Yeah.
I think one of the really interesting things when we have this sort of narrative journey that we know so well is to put it in a place where it literally cannot succeed.
I think that's one interesting thing, not only with stories don't end a lot of the time in real life, and that's one of the intrinsic difficulties of writing a story, as you say. One thing that I think has been really interesting for me to follow has been online fiction and the way that we have episodic things that build up over years and years and years. I forget the full title, but there's a web novel called A Guide to Evil that's been running for years, and it started as this brilliant deconstruction of how to be a villain and how to make a sensible villain rather than just like, God, why are they just so evil for the sake of it? But after doing this brilliant deconstruction, started to kind of run out of steam and eventually just became a generic villain again. And it's one interesting thing comparing stories to real life, where because you only have so much source material to write a story, you only have so many of your own ideas, and there's less reacting to what's going on other than what you're putting on the page. When it comes to having an ongoing story, things, even though the 12 steps of the hero's journey, the last few steps detail how the hero can't return to the life they had before, it still details a conclusion, which can never really happen.
That's one of my favorite subversions of the rules, the idea that the hero or the detective can't be the criminal.
Yes.
I like a good villain that is refigured as a hero. I think one of the things that, if you'd asked me this maybe 2 years ago, I would not have thought about it in this way. But I think we have to be really wary about refiguring villains as heroes, because it is something that that is extraordinarily problematic in our media. But the other one that I like that you picked up on, that I wanted to bring into you, is this idea of modern detective fiction tends to follow a story arc over many books. So whereas I can't admit to being a deep reader of, say, Miss Marple or Poirot, but we weren't always following them story to story for their personal stories. They were the detective who was going to come and solve the crime. But a couple of Australian expat Irish authors that I'm quite a big fan of are Adrian McGinty and Devla McTiernan, who I recently spoke to, and both of their stories look at Irish detectives. Adrian McGinty's Sean Duffy is working in the 80s, in the time of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, and we're as much invested in their story as we are in the individual crimes that are solved in each book. And that's what's really interesting, is when the arc extends over multiple books. So we kind of have a sub-narrative and then a meta-narrative that we're following, which is another really interesting way to follow the narrative scaffold and then the hero's journey, because the hero's journey is never going to play out in one or even two books.
Yeah, I think it's also very interesting looking at modern adaptations of old murder mysteries and how those have brought the character arc to the detective. Say the original Sherlock. The Sherlock novels, they were episodic, largely self-contained, and the only real references was him, referencing previous things he'd solved. There wasn't any big character arc. But modern adaptations, like the Robert Downey Jr. reboot, like the Benedict Cumberbatch BBC reboot, they've all had these large arcs dealing with Sherlock's character flaws, and that's kind of made those so much more accessible to people because they have something that they can follow rather than just the puzzles.
Also, fascinatingly, this was one that was a real stick out for me in Knox's Decalogue. The sidekick, or the offsider, was meant to be just a little bit dumber than the reader, and they were not allowed to have thoughts that weren't immediately apparent. So they're meant to be our cipher. That's what Knox is saying. The sidekick is the cipher, and the sidekick is dumber than us, so I guess it never feels like we're being talked down to by the reader. Probably in order, I'm not the hugest Jude Law fan at the best of times, but big Martin Freeman fan, and also Lucy Liu in the American adaptation.
I'd forgotten about that one, yeah.
So a Lucy Liu or a Martin Friedman are, these are heroes in their own right in the series, and that's really brought to the fore in the storytelling. So I like when we are able to follow extra characters and they're not getting killed. It's too often in hero narratives. A character, usually a woman, is being killed to fuel the story arc, or they're sidelined. I mean, even Gandalf in Lord of the Rings gets killed off and brought back, and it's a real shame. There's a part of me that wanted to follow his story a little bit more. But
yeah,
I like when secondary characters are actually kind of like secondary primary characters.
Yeah, that was one thing that I really enjoyed, particularly about the Three Taps, was Angela, Miles Bredon's wife in the story. She's brought in as the Watson character, but it's constantly covered that she's actually as intelligent, if not more intelligent, than Miles Bredon himself, but her skill is that she's able to enter this more simple space and, see things from the normal person's perspectives that our detective can't. So her perspective in the Three Taps is really amazing because we get a really nice balance between that Watson character and the strong female character.
I enjoy that. I enjoy having more of a unified approach. I enjoy having multiple points of view that I can take on board. knowing that the sidekick was meant to be dumb, and that was the point of view that I was supposed to be kind of getting in on, that shook me a little bit. But that's the hero's journey too. The hero is individualistic. The hero goes through this on their own. They have help, but the help is peripheral. It very much fits our version of modern society. It very much fits a version of our modern history and, our selfie-obsessed culture. But it's not the only way. And I'd be really curious to see what a collective detective fiction would actually look like.
Yeah, I mean, that's one thing that we're hopefully going to get to in future weeks. Knox was part of this club of detective fiction writers, and they had this really interesting experiment where they all collaborated on this one novel, and each of them wrote one segment without communicating how that was going to tie together as a collective whole. So it'll be really exciting to see how that fills it out.
Multiple characters are all writing the same character.
All writing the same character with the same puzzle. Yeah. And they each basically came up with their own solutions and wrote the story as if it was that way and had to tie it together.
I'm thinking more multiple characters, sort of like a Scooby-Doo without all the, really heavily flagged stereotypes.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. One of the other exciting rules, and people find it a little confronting that I say this is exciting, is the fifth rule that the Chinaman must not factor into the story in Knox's Decalogue. I think when you read that, you initially go like, oh, God, that's a bit dated, isn't it?
Can you disabuse me of that? Yeah, that was my exact. I was just like, ooh, not going there.
One thing I found out in researching this is that Knox is actually doing kind of the opposite of what you think that is saying, right? Mm-hmm. You think that, that's a little racist. You're saying that the foreigner, we don't want him in the story. What it's actually saying, according to other things that Knox wrote, is that you don't want that character to be that stereotype. You don't want to define someone in the story by a stereotype and have them be guilty of it because of that.
Well, I mean, I can get on board with that. And as we talk, I am frantically searching for a book title that has actually escaped me, where we do see that sort of stereotype inverted. The author is Miranda Ruo, and she is an absolutely fantastic Australian author, but she writes under a pen name as well, which I'm just trying to get across. I should have brought this up earlier, but in her book, she refigures the classic Victorian detective is at the time would have been a mistress who has done rather well for herself and now solves crimes with her Polynesian, filling the Watson type role, and it very much sort of helped recreate hero type characters out of people that would have otherwise been marginalized in the more traditional novels. I am going to have to get back to you with that.
We'll throw it up on the podcast.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's one really interesting thing that I see a lot of in what I've read from Ronald Knox is that whilst he uses a lot of old language and a lot of conventions, he was very ahead of his time in a lot of ways. Like The Three Taps reads kind of like a late 90s novel if you just took out a couple of the old odd words in there. We kind of compared it to a series of unfortunate events and the way that is a modern novel that reads like an old one. And there are also a whole bunch of his rules and characters that really do break kind of these old conservative, less open values, like the idea that you don't want people to play into their stereotypes, even though he does use the term Chinaman, which is perhaps a bit dated. There's also Angela Bredon, the character, who's a very strong female character and arguably, perhaps the most useful person on the detective team in his novels with Miles Bredon. And that's a very forward, strong female character in a time where that wasn't as prevalent.
The problem with rules is they codify stereotypes. So, I mean, as soon as we're talking about rules, we know that there are stereotypes of the fiction. That's what narrative theory tells us, is that we tell these stories in a certain way almost to put events in order, and then we understand the order as rules. So I think it's always important to acknowledge things like stereotypes. We have them. It's the old horribly dragged out adage of everyone has a right to their opinion, which is wrong. It's wrong. Everyone has an opinion. You cannot stop yourself having opinions, but we use that to justify this idea that we should always be able to voice them. And stereotypes exist in our brains, whether we acknowledge them or not. It's when we then decide to use them. So in fiction, we decide to drag out a stereotype, which is usually a lazy shorthand way of making the reader go, aha, the hero, or aha, the villain, because of the white or the black hat that they wear. And then clever authors go, here was a trope, here was a stereotype, and I'm going to show you a new way of looking at it. By the way, Mandy Ruo's...
We got it.
Miranda Ruo's pen name is MJ Tia.
Oh, I've heard that one, yeah.
The book is She Be Damned.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely fantastic. So her detective is Eloise Chauncey, and she is a courtesan turned private detective. And yeah, it's an absolutely fantastic look at the tropes of Victorian fiction, but then also inverting them and subverting them and taking them into our modern era in a way that we can look at them.
We might have to have that on the show sometime. All right, well, Andrew, thank you so much for joining us on Death of the Reader this week. You can catch Andrew on Final Draft on Saturdays on 2SER.
It's a pleasure, Felix.
Thank you. You're listening to Death of the Reader on 2SER 107.3, and it is time for the Throwdown.
All right. Old Herds is going to lay it out straight to you. My man Flex here has only read up to chapter 7, but I have read the whole thing, the whole novel. So we both come up with our own culprit theories, and I'm going to put his to the test to see if we can figure out who the criminal is. Sound good, Flex?
I think I'm ready.
Do you have your detective notebooks prepared? It's time for the final throwdown. 2 stories with a fishing pole.
You've titled it 2 Stories with a Fishing Pole.
Yes.
That makes me a little concerned.
No, it's a perfectly logical theory.
The only characters who've been presented with the fishing pole in the story thus far, one of them's dead, the other's like 80 years old.
Well, that gives you 2 whole culprits. My theory can work for 2 people. Your theory can't even work for 1 person, and I'm going to let you know why.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Hope you're ready for this.
Getting into this, we have 8 suspects, maybe 3 of which are serious, against 3 detective characters.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got Miles Braden, our Sherlock, our detective. We've got Officer Leyland, our Lestrade, and we have Braden's wife, Angela, our Watson. Now, obviously, you're like our Lestrade, but between you and I, Herds, who's Sherlock, who's Watson?
I mean, clearly I am the Sherlock because I'm just such a dapper gentleman.
That's fine with me, because I've always long been of the opinion that Watson is the true hero of the Sherlock stories. And I think that Angela embodies that, in that she is clearly smarter than Braden, but she's not one that's, interested in the profession.
She's just a little bit cleverer, and she also apparently ties him up in a game of patience every night. Apparently that's just what she's known for. It's great.
So shout out to the best character in the book.
Shout out to Angela. We love her.
Okay, so let's just quickly break this down, because we have Ferrers, the doctor who gave the autopsy.
Yep.
I think it's pretty flat out obvious that it can't be Ferrers. He's been mentioned twice this far in the story, has no real character moments. He's just the autopsy man.
Yeah, he doesn't seem to have a connection. And obviously, in a murder mystery, it's pretty important to figure out if your doctors are reliable, because sometimes they can say someone's dead when they're not. And we want to figure out that right quick.
Exactly.
And you think the doc is reliable?
I think that the doc is reliable. I'm going to lock that one
Locking it in. All right, cool.
I would feel cheated if he was unreliable, because there doesn't seem to be any presentation of it. Then our other 2 main suspects... Pulteney and Brinkman. Pulteney's the old man who's there to fish, and Brinkman's the secretary of the Load of Mischief, the inn in which the incident takes place.
But Flex, what about the boots and the maid? Aren't they suspicious?
Well, they're definitely made to be suspicious. They're caught, listening at locks. They're caught doing all of this weird stuff. But every time that's mentioned, there's always an excuse for it. It's like, oh, it's just a country town. The people out here are a bit weird.
Maybe, yeah. I believe the maid is described as being, lovely for the town that she lives in, which I think is an insult. I'm not sure. Yeah, speaking of lovely, though, the only other character that I might draw your attention to is Mrs. Davis.
Well, I mean, Mrs. Davis, I guess you could say that it's presented she might have killed her husband.
I was going to say, suspiciously lacking a husband. Maybe.
Because nearly every time her character is mentioned, it's mentioned she's a widow, and then there's photos of him around the place. So you could maybe say that's a motive, but I think that's drawing a bit of a longbow.
Maybe her husband is actually a ghost, and that's what killed Mottram. It wasn't gas, it was ghost, guys. We figured it out.
Of course, because a ghost could fit in the gas tank.
But exactly, this is you bring it on quick, Flex. You catch it on. We got this. But I think we've pretty solidly narrowed it down, at least as far as Flex is concerned, to two primary suspects. We got Pulteney, the old fisherman, and he's got a fishing pole. He's having a good old time. And Mr. Brinkman, who is the secretary of the establishment, and much more concerned with financial matters.
Now, I think it's Brinkman.
What? Why? Tell us. And now, before you tell us, there are three main things that we want to have ironed out by the end of this discussion. It's the who done it, the how done it, and the why done it. These are the three tenets of the murder mystery genre, the detective fiction genre. So that's what you need to be keeping track of in your notebook. You reckon you can solve this, Flex?
I reckon I can.
All right, let's give it a go.
So the first thing I think is that Brinkman is one of the first characters presented with motive, right? There's this discussion between Pulteney and Brinkman where they're discussing why Mottram would have chosen to commit suicide in the Load of Mischief, this real backwater small town.
Right.
Now, both of them present a motive in that scene, in that Pulteney says like, "Oh, it'd ruin the town or whatever." But then Brinkman says, "Well, I think it'd bring notoriety to the town, wouldn't it?" Now, the thing is, right? I think that both of those characters are given motive in that scene, but I feel like Brinkman's is the one I believe in the most, because when you're like, "Oh, the guy's died in this town. Yeah, God, that's going to give the town a bad reputation." You're thinking about the gritty, gruesome side of it. Who thinks, no, that'd be a good PR boost? Like, I guess maybe he's the secretary of the and he's the secretary of the hotel, right? So he probably wants business in this town.
Well, yes, maybe that kindly old man is hiding something behind those eyes. Angela says he's very likable, but really, how well could she read people?
Well, that's the other thing, is I trust Angela.
Do you now? More than Bredon?
Absolutely. Bredon says he trusts Angela more than himself.
We're all just a bunch of idiots. Who knows? We'll have to learn.
Now, the other thing is that Brinkman says he was the one that found the body first, which to me says opportunity, right? He's the secretary, so he probably has keys to the whole place. He could have gone in there earlier. He could have, he probably knows how the gas taps work, so he could have explicitly made something that seemed confusing. Right? I think he's also the one that relays to us that one of the gas taps is stiffer than the others, which isn't a piece of information you'd notice unless you've dealt with them a lot.
Well, he does show up with the boots and the maid, doesn't he? Or at least with the boots, certainly.
Well, he says he does, but he could have gone in, then gotten the boots, come back and said look everyone, a corpse. How did this happen?
I feel like that would be very easy to, if the boots just came out and said that's not true, that'd be a very easy lie to get caught in.
Well, that would be, but at the same time, they have a job on the line, and that they then know that they're working with someone who maybe could be, dangerous to them.
Maybe.
So, if later on down the line one of the boots quits, that's going to be a big red flashing light for me.
Maybe. I keep an eye on them boots. Make sure they don't get off on the wrong foot. Hey, got him. Yeah. Well, obviously, I am here to disagree. I think that the one and only culprit that exists in this entire hotel is old Mr. Pulteney.
I think you are ridiculous.
Sir. No, sir. You see, the clues have been laid before us. First off, Pulteney is the first character that we meet in the whole novel. The whole novel when we're heading to the hotel. He's off fishing by the lake, and you think, my goodness, Herds, that's so unsuspicious. Just doing fishing? That's nothing. But he says that the cops had showed up just before he left. That seems mighty convenient to me. Secondly, he has those long fishing poles. There's a real big, mess made of how it was locked from the inside and the keys were in the door and all that nonsense. So no human could have locked it from the outside. But the window was slightly open, and thus I posit to you.
Oh, no.
That Mr. Pulteney, from the second story with the fishing pole, hooked the tap and turned it. Because that's why there's no fingertips.
No!
That's why there's no fingerprints. Because it was the fishing pole.
First of all, we haven't had a two-story ladder presented in the story. Second of all, the windows have bars over the outside.
Maybe he made a ladder out of fishing poles. You don't know. Third of all, it says that the window opens a slight bit. And it's not presented to us that there's... thin enough for a wire to fit in. Come on now. You gotta know these murder mystery novels, they're tricky, you see. You gotta be on the lookout for all sorts of like wires jigging the locks and like vents with poison darts in them and like all that nonsense. I'm just saying.
All right then.
With the poison bolt. That's all I'm saying.
So present to me then a second piece of motive for Pulteney.
Motive? Well, as he says, someone dying in the hotel would be a really big shame. You know, it'd be a shame if the reputation of the establishment was to be brought down. I'm just saying, I think he has a long-standing grudge against the establishment. He is, after all, American, and a big theme of the novel so far has been the kind of contrast between the British and the American way of doing things, particularly in architecture. And I think that Pulteney is trying to get one back for Uncle Sam.
I think that's absurd.
That is the theory. Just you wait. 2 weeks' time, you're going to be eating it. You're going to be eating it, sir.
No.
No?
Okay. Now, let's just quickly break this down because, first of all, Pulteney, old man, second story, that's just ridiculous.
Nah, dude.
But maybe there's another way he could have done it, all right? Let's just put that on the table. Let's ignore that
Pulteney,
your method is absurd.
psychopath. 80-year-old psychopath. That's the headline in the papers.
The thing that Pulteney is complaining about in the story is that there aren't enough fish in the region.
It's true.
And if he's trying to tarnish the reputation of the town, there's two things that he could be doing there. Is either lowering the price that it costs him to get there, not fixing the fish problem.
He's getting them to go away. He wants them away so he can do the fishing order himself.
Dude. Who's going away?
Everyone. The hotel's going to shut down. He's going to live there in his little like camper van and he's going to fish
I disagree.
all day long. He's going to have a great time. And that's Pulteney's motive. Done. Done.
It's mentioned
Case
that there's
closed.
a part of Mottram's family.
End of episode.
It's mentioned that there's a part of Mottram's family who lives a bit down the river.
Yeah.
Who runs a business a bit down the river, and it's implied that maybe that business is doing harm and kind of damaging the fishing thing.
It is.
All right?
It is. You're just supporting my theory even more.
No, because it's not Mottram's explicit business. It's mentioned that he's starting to, lose ties with those things as he's getting older and selling those businesses and whatnot. And Mottram also comes there to fish, so if it's harming his own region of fishing, surely he'd have the same motive as Pulteney, which doesn't seem to line up at all if they want the same thing. The other thing is that we still have to deal with the euthanasia policy because it's in the introduction to the novel. We're not just going to drop that. Pulteney's not getting anything from the policy.
What if Mottram asked Pulteney to do him in? Because he didn't have the heart to take his own life, but he asked his old friend to do it.
You know what? Of everything you've said thus far, that's the most plausible, but I still disagree.
I'm just saying, I think that that's where it's all going to tie back to. That's why it's a story without a moral. Because a man did not commit suicide, but he asked someone else. So it's assisted suicide. I don't know where that falls in the lore of the insurance company, the indescribable, but I sure can't describe it.
Well, I think when you're reading this novel and you are reading along with us, there are certain things that the novel will raise that you can't forget about. For example, the town over is mentioned to have a parish. It's mentioned that Mottram has a Bible on his bedside that's put at every other hotel. It's mentioned that Mottram wants to give money to charities, and all of these things kind of tie into this theme of perhaps a church charity. And listen, I know, spoilerific, but the next chapter title mentions a bishop.
Have you been reading ahead, Flex? Come on. That's not fair
I don't
play.
think a chapter title.
Disqualified.
Whatever.
Tell me, please. Go on,
Anyway,
Flex. Real friends here.
I think that we're going to get down to the fact that Brinkman wants to start to repair things in the town by having Mottram's will give money to that charity.
There you go.
That church charity, all right? I think that's the tie-in. Now, the one thing I will say that's going for you here is that doesn't exclude that Pulteney is involved. It could be that both of them are involved.
Maybe it's a Hot Fuzz situation. Suppose for Hot Fuzz.
I think that it's most likely that Brinkman is trying to set up something with Mottram to get the most out of his euthanasia policy for the place that he loved, that he visits every year.
It's got to be a stitch-up, dude. I don't see any way around it. There's no way this is not some kind of big conspiracy. Maybe Mrs. Davis, maybe she's involved too. Maybe they're all in on it.
It's one of those things with a title like A Story Without a Moral, I could almost agree with that. But at the same time, I don't think it's going to be that much. Like, that feels like a cheap ending to me.
Well, you'd be surprised what kind of endings these murder mystery writers can get away with, given the because we've still got 14 chapters or something to read through. So, well, you do.
Well, you're not wrong. And I think that it could be brought around, but with the information we have presented to us right now,
In the early part of the story.
I think that an old man climbing a 2-story building with a fishing pole
Yes.
is significantly less plausible than the secretary with the keys to the building breaking into the room early.
Big disagree. 100% not true. This is just unfair. No, I mean, I would love for you to explain then why the room has been locked from the inside then. What's going on there?
Alrighty, so first of all, the room being...
Locked rooms, they're fun.
Closed rooms are a staple of the mystery genre.
They are.
But the whole trick with closed rooms is that to solve a closed room, all you have to do is find out how it's not a closed room. So in this case, what I'm saying is that Brinkman probably went in there beforehand using a key that he probably has as a secretary of the building, then did whatever it was he needed to do,
What did he do?
then gathered the boots, the maids, brought them in and was like, look at what's happened. You know, we have to break down this door. So they break down the door, and then it doesn't matter the way that the lock was, however he left it. You know, he could have opened the door, turned the lock back to the state that it was, and then smashed it out of its door frame just to dress it up for the police.
Doesn't he manage that building though? Isn't that like his whole thing?
Well, yeah, but the cost of a door relative to the payout of the euthanasia policy.
The euthanasia policy? The euthanasia coming to his store and seeing all the fine wares that he
It's
has.
a terrible joke.
No, it's the best joke. You better not cut this. I'll be very sad.
There's obviously flaws in the reasoning here. The one thing that sells me on it being Brinkman is the fact that the gas tap has a print from being turned on, but not turned off.
Suspicious. Only a fishing hook could have done it, sir. Or a fish.
I think if it was a fishing hook, they would have mentioned that there was a tense line or something in the dust on the gas tap or whatever
Well, who
it was.
examined the tap? It was
the police.
It was the police, was it? Yeah, I don't know. Maybe Leyland has noticed something he's keeping to himself.
Maybe he does.
I don't know. Do you think that Leyland is totally reliable?
I think that Leyland is reliable, but I don't think that we're being told everything he's lighted upon. One of Knox's rules is that we must not have hidden from us what is lighted upon by the detective.
Yes, but he's not the detective.
He's not the detective.
He's also not the Watson. He's not the, the Watson is supposed to be the bumbling friend, but Angela doesn't really fit that description either. But she serves the role of Watson in the story.
She is so intelligent that she's able to act as the Watson.
Yeah, she's almost the real detective, one might say. That's another theory.
Agree.
That's another theory.
But I reckon what's probably happened is that, let's say, for example, that Brinkman turned on the tap, and then, left the room. And then when he came back and he's like, oh gosh, look, it's what happened. He's died. Quick, we gotta get in, and with all of the maids and whatnot. And then, he's like, oh, we better not disturb the crime scene, and then turned it off with a covered hand or something. That's why there's only a print on one side of the tap.
Maybe. Well, there's definitely something fishy going on there with how, there are fingerprints on one side but not the other, because that indicates intent, right? It's not an accident because someone had to have turned it off.
Exactly.
And they didn't want to be seen or heard or smelt, I assume. And that's why it's Poltney, because he smells of fish.
No.
He smells fishy.
I disagree. As an
agree.
American citizen, Poltney is probably well respective of his hygiene.
That's a big disagree. Although everything should be just how he likes it. That's what Mrs. Davis says, I believe.
Exactly. You're just wearing your own argument thin. It's got to be Brinkman.
Nah. I don't think it is. Well, we'll see how we go. We got a whole bunch of chapters to go. There's plenty of time for me to figure out how to take you down.
Ooh. Well, final thing I want to get your agree or disagree on.
Uh-huh.
Accident, murder, suicide. Which is it? Which did you think when you were at this point in the story?
Murder. Done.
Murder?
Easy.
I reckon accident. I reckon accident with a culprit.
Okay. How's that work?
Now, someone turned the tap on and left a print, but there's no print from it having been turned back off.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what I reckon's probably happened there is that Brinkman's turned it on, left one of the other, secondary taps open. He's died, come back into the room and gone, oh God, I've killed him. And then he's like, well, I can't leave my prints on this, so he turns off the master tap.
There you go.
While
maybe.
the secondary tap is still on.
I suppose there's got to be something funky on with those taps. There's 3 of them.
Because
after all.
that also deals with the story without a moral. Because if it is a murder, how do we not ascribe a moral to murder is wrong?
It's an excellent question, Flex. I suppose we'll have to find out. Have to find out at the end of this piece of art.
I'm glad that you were able to join along with Herds and myself on our quest for dominance in this murder mystery fight. Next week, we'll be looking at chapters 8 to 18 of the 3 taps as we slowly creep towards victory. Well, I creep towards victory. And maybe you do as well, but not Herds, because Pulteney can't climb 2-story buildings.
Yes, he could. You can't underestimate those old people with fishing poles. They're very powerful and dexterous despite their age.
Well, thank you so much for tuning into Death of the Reader. If there's anything else you want to hear from us, an extended chat with Andrew Pople, a bit of extra discussion about how we think the crime was done, be sure to check out the podcast online. We'll see you next week.